Like Indianapolis, like in a house show or something
Right.
like that.
What was, I guess, talking about Kevin and Scott and the whole Kliq, so to speak.
Right.
And, I don't know if Shawn was in at the time. Shawn Waltman, was he there at the time? Oh.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. 'Cause when Scott was there, he was the one who beat Scott. And,
Oh yeah. Okay. That's right. That's right.
Well, there was no Kliq without the kid.
Right. Right. That's
That
true.
wouldn't be complete. I don't think.
What is the biggest misconception about the whole entire Kliq? And you know, you've heard stories. Well, what's the biggest misconception about the Kliq, first of all?
I think the biggest misconception is the power.
Right.
You know, I used to love when guys would be handing around the dirt sheet and they'd see like I love seeing my name or the Kliq or that stuff and have the word power next
Right.
to it, because in the wrestling business, power is really a guy that makes suggestions to the boss and he likes them.
Right.
And he uses them. You know, I mean, and that's really what it is. You just go to him and go, hey, I got an idea for an angle.
Right.
You know, and we had an idea for an angle for the ladder match, and they did it, and it turned out to be great. No one really said, oh, Shawn's power did that, because I hadn't quite gotten, I wasn't over at that time. So all that stuff comes with, you know, once you get on top, you know. But we used to make suggestions for other people too, all the time.
Right.
You know, I can remember that little Candido couldn't stand us, but we used to make suggestions for him all the time.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah.
Because he said you guys ran him out.
No, I mean, most of them guys, the Shanes, the Candidos, you know, and even Brett, it's paranoia,
Right.
most of them. And it's not being able to look yourself in the mirror and say, you know what, either I'm losing it or I don't have it, or, you know, something's not flying right, because it's not anything that we ever did. We, you know, me or Kevin, we can't run nobody out. That's Vince's decision, you know. And most of the time, what bothers Vince the most is the guys that get caught up in that crap.
Right.
But he was the one that, you know, he used to ask us. You know, he used to call me when I was at home, hey, you know, give me some, you know, think of some ideas and stuff like that. I mean, there was a time when, you know, before the whole Kliq thing, when I was up in Stanford actually writing the Raws, but nobody said I had power then.
Right.
You know, because I wasn't on top, and I didn't have these other, you know, we all didn't hang around together. And it's, you know, I can remember, you know, Lex Luger's the guy that gave us that name, and you know, I don't know, it was just funny because, you know, you think to yourself, I mean, to me, it's just me hanging out with my buddies, and us going to the boss and making suggestions,
Right.
and him liking it. But then with the whole wrestling underground media and the boys, you know, again, in this business is the biggest denial rate of any business around, and you know, none of these guys want to admit that, you know, maybe I'm not talented, maybe I'm not as talented as that guy, maybe I don't have as good of ideas as that guy, and you know, that's all we did. All we did is eat, sleep, and drink wrestling. You know, me, Kevin, and Scott, we were never home. You know, we were always having to do extra stuff.
Right.
So what else were we going to do except talk about the wrestling business, because it consumed our lives at that point.
Shane, we did an interview with Shane. He said he had a match with Scott somewhere. I forgot, to one of the house shows. There was supposedly you guys were going to go on strike or something like that. It was rumored in the sheets that the Kliq was going to hold Vince, right?
We're going to go on strike.
Right. And,
no, I remember it was Indianapolis, and we just asked him. You know, we just said, you know, because the angles, the show, there was no strike. It was you know, it was me saying, I think what we're doing right now, angle-wise and stuff like that, which eventually turned into the WWF attitude.
Right.
Was me saying, whatever we're doing right now is wrong. It stinks. So we just said, can you come down and let's figure out a new way to. The company's got to go in a different direction, you know. And we came down. We all just met in the hotel, and we went through the whole list. And he brought it all. He goes, okay, I want you to go through this list and you tell me who you think can work and who can't.
Right.
So we just went through the list and did that. No one got fired. No one got hired.
Right.
Anything like that. He just wanted an idea. And most of the guys, again, people that didn't like us, were the guys, you know, like Candido was a shit. He can work if the fucker would stop worrying about what his girlfriend's doing, you know, and be in denial about it because, you know, whatever, you know. I mean, it's, yeah, he's got to stay focused because the kid could work,
Right.
you know. But I mean, it was just a meeting to go over, you know, and we told him, you ain't got to fly in. It's just something you need to think about. No. You know, he did all that stuff on his own, you know, because he liked it. Vince liked it for years. You have to understand, for years and years, this guy had a bunch of guys who were making a ton of money that were lazy. You know, back in the day, you know, the Hogans, the Beefcakes, all them guys, they were all lazy. None of them cared. They're all too busy getting, messed up, doing whatever,
Right.
doing their thing, and making a shitload of money. Now, for the first time ever, Vince had a bunch of young guys, hungry guys that ate, slept, and drank the wrestling business, and then cared, and cared enough to, and weren't afraid of him. Nobody else called him, and he used to always tell me, he goes, the problem is, nobody tells me anything. He goes, I hear something, I hear it 3 months later, 4 months later. He said, if you just tell me. So I just started being the guy that was honest with him. Something stunk. I said, that stinks. It sucks.
Right.
Why? Because it's this, that, and that. Really? Yeah. I can remember, before, I can remember him finding me $10,000 because stuff gauze down my bike shorts on one of the Raws.
Right.
And him threatening to fine me, and me saying, it's funny. That's funny. Having this big conversation. By the end of the conversation, he takes back the fine and says, we're going there. And going there is now what you see now. The girls, the cuss words, all that stuff. And I had said, and I said to him, Vince, you're 50, at that time he was 50 years old. I said, you're 50 years old. You're trying to tell me what's cool? You're 50 and I'm 30.
Right.
You don't know what's cool anymore. I said, plus, all the boys were laughing at what I did. He goes, well, yeah, but that's the boys. And I said, but who are the boys? I said, you don't think every one of those guys was a wrestling fan? I said, that's what wrestlers are. They're wrestling fans that eventually turn into wrestlers.
Right.
I said, and the people were laughing at one another. And that's, eventually, he just said, God, I think, and now he's, going on to what he's going on to.
Right.
So he liked the fact that he had these guys that cared enough to even go at a house show and say, okay, yeah, we're in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, but that's, that's a horrible show. It sucks. The finishes aren't good. This isn't happening, that's not happening. You're pushing this guy that's a jabroni, or whatever. When he doesn't care, he doesn't like the job, he bitches about everything, and he's not even good.
Right.
And that's when he started just, that's like, it was, years, or like a year before that, but like Lex, he was going to push Lex, but then eventually he looked at him and goes, God, Lex hated the job,
Right.
hated being on the road, didn't like anything, and then ultimately had the whole world at his feet, and and eventually, Vince, eventually saw that, I guess, and just sort of put him in a team or did whatever. But the wrestling business is full of those kind of guys, and it's amazing how many guys go, I want to be in this business, Vince McMahon, make me a millionaire, but I don't want to do anything.
Right. Right.
It's just, it's not how you do it. So we were just guys that took the initiative.